I'm Kate Libby, the Director of Education and the Associate Curator here at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, and I'd like to welcome you back to another installment of Chesapeake Treasure, a feature here on Facebook where we explore some of the more than 68,000 objects in our collections here at the Maritime Museum. So it's starting to feel like spring around the Chesapeake, and in honor of the changing seasons, I wanted to talk about some of the cool stuff in our collections that are not related to oysters, fish, or crabs, but instead focus on a really important industry in the Chesapeake in the mid-19th and through the middle of the 20th century, which was canning. So we talk a lot about canning here as it relates to oysters, and I know a lot of people enjoy like checking out cool oyster cans or collecting oyster cans, but you've got to think that oysters, of course, are an R-month food, a seasonal food. And as you move into the summertime throughout the Chesapeake, but really on the Eastern Shore, that became the growing season. And a lot of these canneries would switch from packing seafood in the winter months to packing produce in the summer months. And that produce cannery industry was incredibly important on the Eastern Shore for counties like Talbot, Dorchester, Wicomico, Worcester. All of these places had major packing operations that supported the community in the summertime. And again, just like with oyster canning, just as you saw, tons of involvement from people all the way down to the lowly shucker, all the way up to the packing house owner and railroad magnates. So you had that same kind of workforce employed in produce canning here in the Chesapeake too, from people picking in the fields all the way up to, again, railroads, because that's how they're transporting a lot of that food. So I pulled together some of the really cool stuff that we have associated here in our collections. And if you were to visit, I just want you to imagine the Chesapeake at the turn of the century when the water and the railroads with steamboats and railroads, this was very much the transportation system that existed in this time period. And so a lot of the packing houses used that transportation system as a way to get their canned produce out and across the United States. And the Eastern Shore of Maryland is known for being incredibly arable, incredibly green. And so a lot of these packing houses not only own their own vessels and boats, and typically boats like skipjacks or boats that might be used, again, and iconically for oystering, in the summertime became Mack trucks hauling watermelons and hauling tomatoes and pumpkins and other types of produce. So what you'll see on the table in front of me is a lot of the stuff associated. So unlike a lot of our oyster cans, the labels for these were not printed directly on the can. They were printed on paper. And so you can see that they're flat, but I want you to imagine them in the round surrounding the cans that they would have been distributed in. So as you can see, though, again, the beauty of these labels is that they convey, the local information. So of course here we have Harrison and Jarboe, which was a really important packing company in Sherwood, Maryland. There were, which is close to the Maritime Museum here, but there were also ones that were packed in Trapp. We've got the Defender brand. Again, you don't really think of these places as sort of commercial hubs, but you've got to remember they had access to steamboats, they had access to the rail line, and that's what you really needed. If we come down here to the Bob White, what I love about this is it tells you exactly what they have. They've got watermelons and cantaloupes, beans, peas, sweet potatoes, and tomatoes. And so think about all the work that would have been involved in that one canning factory. You had people, a lot of these places own their own fields and ran their own farming operations so that they can control their product. So imagine the amount of labor that would have gone into producing all the people that they would have needed seasonally. And again, this is piecework. This is the type of work that you would be seeing done in these packing houses or on these farms, especially in the Eastern Shore, by local African Americans or local whites that would work alongside each other to harvest this produce, to take it into the canning, the canneries, and then to produce it. Over here we've got sort of Lark brand, and again this is Vienna, Maryland. So again, as you go further down the Eastern Shore, each town really had its own packing house. And by 1920 there were over 250 packing houses on the Eastern Shore alone. This is a great one, another Vienna label for the Bob White brand. And I love, again, it's just the suggestion of productivity. You know, you've got this arable landscape and this very handsome pumpkin here in the front. And then finally, back again to Harrison and Jarboe. Tomatoes were made up really the bulk of the packing industry in the 19th and the early 20th century. Some people who worked for these packing houses even had side jobs where they would save the seed from the tomatoes that they packed, dry them, and then sell the seed separately. The other thing that we have over here are some labels. So you pack the cans into boxes, but the boxes need to be labeled too. So we've got some, and as you can see, you'd apply the paint right to this for your tomatoes that are gonna head out. Or you've got spinach. So many of you probably who are watching this can remember some of these packed foods and what they probably tasted like when they got to you in this time period. I mean, if you think about it, you know, packed veggies today, I mean, we prefer fresh. But this would have been a revolutionary new technology in this time period because it allowed you to have produce all year round as opposed to only when it was available. So it meant that, you know, in the dead of winter, you could crack open a can of peaches and taste that sort of sweet, you know, summery lusciousness that you'd associate with an August afternoon. I mean, it was really tremendously popular in the 19th and the early 20th century, although I think many of us, me included, might have some bad memories of things like canned spinach, that some of these things worked a little better than the others in terms of their longevity and like how good they actually were once you busted the can open. So let's talk a little bit about the packing houses themselves. There was the Tillman Packing Company in Talbot County, Harrison and Jarboe. When you go further south, of course, you can't, in Dorchester County, really the king of the canneries was Phillips. Interestingly, if you've been following in the news, recently one of the packing houses that Phillips originally owned has just been purchased by the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, and they're going to hopefully restore that building and bring it back to use. But Phillips at one point, I mean, they had 3,000 people employed in their packing houses. And although they were a much younger city, they were quickly more populous than places like Chestertown that were older, or Easton. As you go further south, of course, into Somerset County, then you've got, in Crisfield, you've got the John T. Handy Packing Company, you've got the Crisfield Packing Company. And a lot of counties like Queen Anne's County or Somerset actually had small little canneries just all along the river, so that if you had local farms, they could bring their produce in and process it and pack it. This was an industry that you don't see as quite as much immigrant labor in the 20th century as we associate with farm production and a lot of this produce production today. In that time period, it was mostly locals. And we have another thing here that I think is a neat indication of what it would have been like to work in these packing houses. So these are tokens, and these tokens would have been produced for each individual packing house. This is for what is it called? Plum Packing Company. I think that's right. So these tokens would have been given to packers who worked in the packing house in lieu of pay. So, and in terms of fairness or workers' rights, of course, they weren't really thinking about that very much when these packing houses were established. So these tokens were essentially scrip. They were not legal tender, but a lot of these packing companies would have their own grocery stores, or they'd have local grocery stores that accepted these tokens in lieu of paper money. However, as you can imagine, this does make it really difficult for you, if you're the person working for these packing houses, to have any flexibility in where you're buying your groceries from, or you know, spending that money any other way than at these company stores. So it's issues like this, and I think these tokens represent so much, although they're very small and pretty humble looking. as you can imagine, this industry became something that in the 1920s, as the labor union movement moved across the United States, these packing houses started to feel the impacts of that. And one of the famous examples was... Hi, welcome back to part 2 of our Chesapeake Treasure on canning. If you were watching the end of part 1, I know we got cut off a little bit. Sorry, it's live, it's crazy. So coming back, all right, so let me fill you in a little bit if you're just joining us. I'm talking about packing houses specifically for produce on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake. And these packing houses from the 1850s all the way up to the 1950s were really huge mainstays of the economy here throughout the Chesapeake in the warm months during the arable growing season. In the early part of the 20th century, you start to see the development of labor unions. And if you've ever read the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, that book explores workers' rights in food production in the United States. And here on the Eastern Shore, that was not an exception either. So we also, in the early part of the 20th century, in the 1920s and the 1930s, the rumblings of unionization began to impact these packing houses, specifically the largest one, which was Phillips Packing Company in Cambridge, Maryland. And so in 1937, union organizers attempted to come into Phillips to organize the workers to allow, to work for better pay, for better rights. This is a time period when average, if you were skinning tomatoes for a full day, you might make $5, and that was considered pretty good wages. So there was actually a huge labor strike in Cambridge in 1937 because of the influence of these outside unionizers. Now, the men that own these packing houses, generally, they're not socialists. They are Methodists, they are Masons, and they are Republicans. Most of them do not have college degrees. They don't own large tracts of land, but they're savvy businessmen who believe in the power of prayer and the importance of their role in the local economy. That said, despite being staunch believers in the labor force and the work that they're doing on the Eastern Shore, and many of them went on to become really wealthy men. And if you go to Cambridge today, you can see houses from this time period where a lot of these packing house owners used to live. They're fancy, they're beautiful homes. But in the as we move from the 1940s into the 1950s, so of course we have World War II. And a lot of these packing houses in the 1940s were employed by the U.S. government. They got contracts to supply C rations and K rations. Some of them were turned into munitions factories in this time period.